This video is sponsored by Alpha Draft, where you can play fantasy esports such as League of Legends, and they have a number of different tournaments on there. I imagine they'll probably have the All-Star tournament when it comes up. NaJin has apparently disbanded, and that means no longer will we see the NaJin team, the NaJin name competing at LCK, and that's actually quite significant because this is one of the original teams within Korean esports in terms of League of Legends, specifically League of Legends. Now, the minutiae of every single season they had, all the little details of what happened and how the teams came together and the battles they had, that's probably better served in a long article than a video like this. But I wanted to go over some of the larger, more general concepts and then kind of characterize what NaJin was like as an organization and as a team as they went through their history. So first and foremost, an important point to make is that NaJin was one of the teams that came around for League of Legends and actually was not a KeSPA team. Now, KeSPA is the Korean Esports Association, and a lot of the teams which not so long later on quickly became part of KeSPA, so people like SK Telecom were already in KeSPA, KT Rolster were already in KeSPA. Some of these other teams, these are all KeSPA teams, mainly 2013 onwards we're talking about. In 2012, League of Legends was still growing as a game and had just gotten picked up by OGN. So a lot of the organizations weren't within KeSPA, but eventually a lot of them would be, because obviously the Azubu teams went over to CJ. But in the end, NaJin was eventually, as far as I know, incorporated within KeSPA. But they started off on their own in that sense. So the fact that they were very successful early on was before a lot of the infrastructure of what happened with KeSPA organizations came along and all the big money that those orgs were able to bring. So one of the interesting things is that actually the NaJin team comes out of one of the earliest Korean competitive teams. So I think the Korean server maybe went online. I think it was something like at the very end of 2011. And the team back then was actually what would become the first NaJin team was a team called EDG, Extreme Dive Gaming. And this is Macnoon and a bunch of other players who you wouldn't remember most of them now, but later on they would go on to play in the first NaJin team. Famously, they went to the World Cyber Games qualifier. They qualified for the World Cyber Games, but they actually lost in the round of 8 there. And the World Cyber Games at the time was like the Olympics of gaming and was won by the North American team. But as I remember, I think in the round of 8 they actually lost to the Polish team who went to the final themselves, and were a number of the players who later on went on to be in that MYM Polish team, which in the summer split of 2013, Season 3, actually competed within EULCS. So the original team for NaJin, the actual NaJin org, was created in February, and part of the reason it was created was so that the team could go and compete in this first OGN tournament, which is actually just a 4-team invitation. It was NaJin and MIG, what would eventually become MIG Frost, eventually Azubu Frost, CJ Frost. But the core of those teams, those are the 2 Korean teams who qualified. And then there was World Elite, who were the best Chinese team, and there was CLG, who were thought of as the best NA team at the time, even though actually they would later on be eclipsed by TSM, obviously. Now, the interesting thing about the NaJin teams of 2012 is, first of all, there's a massive break happens, because another thing that happened was, okay, yes, MIG had their 2 teams. They had the sister team concept, which was essentially created by On Air from MIG, Maximum Impact Gaming. And they had MIG Frost, which is the main team of Mad Life, and eventually later on, years later, Shy, but at the time, Woong and Cloud Templar, all those guys. But then they would pick up the sister team, which was Blaze, which was Captain Jack and Ambition and Reaped. So NaJin actually had got the same concept. After the first season, which was the spring one, where they were actually very close to beating Frost in an amazing game and might have been a favourite to win the title if they hadn't have lost there, they would make a sister team. And part of the reason they did it initially was because Macanoon was the star player of NaJin, but the rest of the team didn't really fit with his style because he was this extremely aggressive player. So they put together Sword, which is this extremely aggressive team full of youngsters, new players, to go around Macanoon, and then they took the other players and made Shield out of it. Now, interestingly, after splitting like that, Shield was the team that was massively underwhelming for many, many years and didn't particularly achieve any success, really. Meanwhile, Sword was the one that was very competitive going forwards because they had Macnoon. They were one of the better teams in the summer split. Then in the winter split of 2012, going into early 2013, they actually were able to win the OGN title. Now, one of the interesting things is, I feel like people always exaggerate the fact that they won as they were the best team in the league that split. No, not really, actually. Like, what's interesting about their run is, in the group stage, it was Blaze and Frost who were the best teams, and by a decent margin, actually, and Frost were the teams who never lost in a best-of-5 series and always won in blind pick and had all the clutch factor. So these were the teams, actually, you expected to win the league. But as it went on, they had this amazing playoff run, Sword, where they got better and better and better, and eventually they did win in the final. Crucially, actually in part due to the 2v2 synergy of the jungler and top laner. So it was The jungler was obviously Watch, and the top laner was Macnoon, and they really won out against Shy and Cloud Templar. That was a big part of why they won this finally. And I actually think Shy was a better top laner at the time than Macnoon. You could make a case on either side, though. But they were both extremely top-tier players. The rest of the teams, both very good, but actually Sword were able to win 3-0 and win the OGN title. I'd characterize 2012 as they were contenders most of the time for the OGN titles, and it was only at the end that they had this miracle run and they managed to win the title. As one of the better teams, but not in any way a favourite going into the playoffs. Then you come into 2013, and now you have a scenario where Sword goes right downhill with the same lineup. They go to shit. Shield lineup by the summer has gotten in place where it's essentially the Shield lineup you think of the next year, 2014, but with no Faye as the jungler. But the problem is a lot of the players aren't ready. Like Goong isn't quite ready. Save's like good, but he hasn't quite gotten there. Zephyr's like pretty shady, can't really hang together at a point in time. And Gorilla's still expanding his champion pool to become a very good player. So they're too green at that point in time. You get to the winter season though, and now, as Sword's dropping off, Shield rises up. And actually, they were close to coming to the final of this split. Although, admittedly, they were in the very weak part of the bracket. But they were close to beating the Ozone team who went to the final. It was a great series, a 4-game series. Some really close games there. And No Faye showed off a lot of interesting jungle pathing. And the youngsters were getting it together, but not quite yet. Now, interestingly, 2013 was really Sword dropping off a cliff. They were still decent in the spring, but then had no impact on the playoffs. Then you go into the summer, and even though the lineup's really good because they get Expression in who's very highly touted as this sick carry top laner, the whole team top to bottom has some good players in it. Prey's still very good, but somehow it just doesn't work. They're not getting any kind of results, and by the winter they're almost irrelevant. They're still a decent team. They always play well when they get to the NLB part of the tournament, but in the actual OGNs they're never making deep runs and having any significance. So, to me, 2013 for the NaJin organization is like Shield starting to get their shit together, starting to finally become a team that one day might be able to contend. We find out they would the next year, but haven't quite got there. Sword continually gets good players, and they're still stacking Sword to be the good team, but overall, it's underachieving, and it's always underwhelming Sword. Now, they did have one result that was good, which is because of the circuit point system, and having won the first split, which is technically the winter split of Season 3, they were the team that were able to go to the Worlds purely based on circuit points in that particular sense. So as a result, they got there. No one had seen them before. They had a shaky round of 8 match against Gambit with Voidal and just got through that though. Got past the loss that they'd had there. And then they managed to go full 5 games against SK Telecom, although SK Telecom was still the better team. And you look at it, and realistically, it was fairly unlikely SK Telecom was going to lose. Not least because Faker was in God mode and had some incredible plays in that series. But they took the world champions to 5 games that no one else had done. So they had that one result, which partly I think was the surprise factor. Nagne came in, who hadn't really been playing before then. It just turned out Gragas was good, and Gragas happened to be a very strong pick during that tournament with the sort of in-tournament meta that we had for that tournament. But beyond that, they were just underwhelming. In fact, if anything, the fact they could do so well then and then go home in OG and Winter and not do anything particularly impressive just highlights how underwhelming this team was. Then you go into 2014, though. Now, Sword just drops off. The spring split, they try with similar lineup with slightly different players. Like they try a different player, it doesn't quite work out. They eventually just change roster entirely. Shield, on the other hand, continues to build. Okay, No Faye leaves. He was a very interesting player, but they managed to get Watch they put over onto the Shield team, which to me signified actually that they knew they were experimenting in terms of going forwards with the Sword lineup. That was now going to be the experimental team, because Sword had always been the A team and Shield the B team, and now they knew that Shield had to be the A team, and there was the only one with the pieces to really compete. So they put Watch over there, veteran jungler, knows how to get a top laner rolling, so he has Save there, who's got a lot of potential. And this is where 2014 is when Shield takes over. Shield makes a run all the way to the final of that OGN. Obviously, they lose to Blue, but Blue is an extremely great, all-time dominant team, so very, very good team. But they had an excellent run there. Save really emerged as like one of the best top laners in the world. Goon was having really nice performances on a particularly small champion pool, but very good on those champions. And they'd even managed to make Zephyr as this clean-up workman AD carry kind of work, and partly because Gorilla was becoming very good as a support player. And he was kind of carrying him through laning phase, making it work for him. Then you go into the summer. Now, people often characterize the summer as like, oh, Shield went to shit. Not really. They actually made it to the round of 8, thanks to whatever happened in the group. I guess it was a bit touch and go there. But when they get to the round of 8, they actually took KT Arrows to 5 games, and they really were close to winning that. They were ahead in the 5th game, but KT Arrows came back, and obviously KT Arrows will go to the final and win the tournament itself in impressive fashion. Now, yes, in MLB they went to shit, and as a result, that's why people think of the Shield team as like, oh, they were dropping off at that point in time. But if you remember, I actually made the prediction after the NLB and before the regional qualifier that Shield would beat KT Arrows, who just won OGN. And the reason why was when I watched the matchup, they had a great matchup that was very close, and I could see how Shield had certain advantages in certain areas, and if they played a game out a certain way, they'd have a chance. Now, what I didn't know is they'd actually wreck KT Arrows and everyone all the way through the regional and qualify for Worlds. Sadly, at Worlds, they had essentially the inverse of what Sword had done in 2013. So 2013, Sword's underwhelming, but has a sick Worlds run, like a real spike. Shield, the opposite way around. They have this nice run throughout all the big OGN seasons. Then they just drop off at Worlds. Like, yes, they get out of the group, but even then they were looking shaky against Alliance. Could have got 0-2 there. They had games where they were losing a game and they were playing close games against C9. Then they get to the round of 8 and OMG brings in Cloud and just wrecks them outright 3-0, utterly stomps them, and Goong just... Not Goong, rather. Going just stamps all over Save's head. Very embarrassing series for what should have been one of the top teams and should at least have been in the semis, if not had a chance to go to the final, when you consider they had no Koreans in their side of the bracket. So very underwhelming there. That's essentially the end of the OGN era before we get to LCK. Now, here's what's interesting. So you go into Season 5, and even though I'm going to talk about NaJin, you have to point out that the guys from NaJin kind of fucked up whatever was going on in terms of the organization to allow players to leave and make what was GE Tigers, because GE Tigers featured 4 ex-NaJin players. They had Kuro, the mid laner who'd been in Sword. They had Hojin, the jungler who'd been in Sword. They had Prey, who'd been in Sword but had been retired for like a year, the AD carrier once upon a time a start. And you had Gorilla, who was one of the best support players in the entire world. I'd say second best support player in the world after Mata, although it's there with Heart as well. And he obviously was actually a NaJin Shield player directly. Then you had No Fei, who'd formerly been a NaJin Shield player, who was the coach of this team. So basically, they're like an ex-NaJin team. And obviously, they would go on to make the final of LCK that spring. They would go on to make 3rd place with KOO Tigers in the summer. And they obviously went to the final of Worlds at the end of Season 5. So you see all the NaJin talent. And when they got out of NaJin, they were able to make better use of that talent and actually go to a Worlds run to the final. So it almost highlights the underachieving, underwhelming nature of the NaJin org, which I'll get to in a second. So NaJin itself as an org, now here's the thing, from the end of Season 4, they had Duke as a top laner. So when they compressed the teams together, they had Duke, they had OQ, this is extremely good. These are 2 players who were considered the next in line to become the best at their roles, both in Korea, at AD carry and top laner, and potentially in the world, and were very good. LQ more inconsistent, but still very hard carry when he would have on games. And Duke, for me, absolutely one of the best top laners in the world in Season 5. Admittedly, more of a solo carry top than one who works with the team, and that did eventually become the meta, how you snowball the carry top laner, but who works within the team concept and you play around him. So, did have some issues there. They still had Goong, who was decent, but on and off. More like only 1 out of 3 games he'd go ham, then one he'd have in a bad game, and then one he'd have an average game. So you always thought they should have tried the other players. The problem here is, Spring Split, they don't even make the playoffs, but Duke's the MVP of the whole league because he was sick. Summer, they finished 5th place in the playoffs, losing to KOO, who obviously did turn out to be very good. But at the time, everyone looked at it and said that should be winnable because KOO had been shaky at times, even though had that sick win streak of like best of 3s in a row. Don't even go further than that. So actually, they never even had a top 4 in OGN/LCK all year long. And then obviously, that's pretty much it. Like they don't go to Worlds. It's over for them at that point in time. So very disappointing. Now you have to look at the NaJin org and think about how much talent they have and realize it was mismanaged as an org. Like in 2012, no problem there. People are still getting shit together as an org. They're still figuring out sister teams. They do win OGN eventually, which is great. They had put a team around Macnoon and built it properly. That's all great. But they remind me in 2013 of the problems CJ had, where CJ had all these talents in Frost and Blaze, but they could never get the right mixture together. They held on to certain players for too long, were insistent on playing certain players too long. So in the CJ org, you look at the fact they chose Shy over Flame. Then you look at the fact that they tried to keep messing with Helios in some of the lineups. Then you look at the fact that they kept all the Captain Jack a little bit too long initially. Then you look at the fact that they kept Space forever. And you can see the mismanagement here. These are bad decisions at the time, beforehand, and then afterwards. Obviously, and in hindsight, we can go, why the fuck did they do that? You can't understand that. So the coaching staff has to take some of the blame there. When you look at NaJin, it's the same problem, if not worse. Some of those Sword teams they had in 2013 had fantastic players, but they did not do a good job in terms of coaching those teams. They play very one-dimensional styles, such as waiting for expression to carry the game on certain specific champions. They didn't know how to rotate very well in terms of map objectives. They always were reasonably poor in that respect. They had all these sick players. They didn't have the team concept going whatsoever, though. And it's no surprise when you look at the way it's organised, they would constantly change a player. Then they would have a bad OGN season. Because remember, OGN season could sometimes be only a few games. Then you're out. Then they change player. Then the same team would have a sick NLB run, usually in 2013 or early 2014. And then you'd go, right, can't wait to see this team next split. But then they'd make roster moves and the whole cycle would start again. So really poorly managed in that respect. Then you've got to look at the fact that, well, why not? Where were the super good strategic coaches within the NaJin organization? Everyone always talked about Reach. Reach was a great Brood War player, but he's a head coach type guy. He's not some genius tactical mastermind. The same guys who were involved were helping them win the winter season were then the ones, the mess of the spring season with the same team in going from 2012 to 2013. Then you look at the same people who got Shield all the way to the final and helped Shield win the qualifier, but then bombed it and didn't have any of the good info on how OMG would play and where the strengths were at Worlds. So you see these key problems and glaring weaknesses, and it ends up looking a lot like the coaching staff did an okay job on an LCK/OGN level, but actually the players won a lot of those games. It was just the brilliance of the players and the talent level we see that got any of those results to some degree. There were some pick by aspects where they did a good job. But you look at it, when you have that much talent, they really did underachieve. And then Season 5 is the ultimate example because they had one of the most talented rosters in the whole league and they couldn't even finish top 4, man. They were just doing terribly. You think of some of the teams. Think of the CJ team that was so close to making the final of LCK Spring this year. They have a way less talented lineup than NaJin, but they get it to work. They get a style that works. They have an identity that makes sense. Even with the crumbs they're working in, they managed to find ways. Okay, so we can't get Shy to play now. Okay, we'll just have him play Mundo all these games and do this. They managed to get something working at least and figure out what their strengths are. Oh, Coco's the main carry. Better load everything up on him so he can win the game then. They know what the fuck they're doing. NaJin was always a team that almost in spite of the talent, like the team would get wins in spite of the coaching rather, just because they had some talent, but they didn't win using they were never more than the sum of their parts. But as an org, you got to look at some of the great players they've had in their history. So they have Macnoon, one of the greatest top laners of all time. He does get overblown a bit because he was extremely one-dimensional as much as he was super aggro. And eventually that could be exploited. But he had Watch with him, who the joke was that was his third summoner spell. He could always have him come to the top lane. That allowed him to play very extremely aggressively. And we always remember that famous game in OGN where he literally goes into the enemy's base and he's farming between waves coming out of the fountain and he's just fucking with the enemy team. And they can't do shit to him because he's fucking Macnoon at the time. He's a god. Then you look at him, got to look at Gorilla next. In my opinion, the best support player in the world in Season 5. A phenomenal talent who eventually did grow into a very versatile, incredibly versatile player in terms of champion pool, style of play, different AD carries he's played with, Prey, Zephyr. These are totally different styles of AD carries. And the way he manages the vision control has always been beautiful. Then you look at Prey, one of the world's best AD carries, if not the best Korean AD carry for most of 2012, early 2013, comes back to a 4 in 2015, has periods where he's extremely good early on in the split. That's where they made those Juggermore comps around him. Then he really gets it together towards Worlds and has this great Worlds run. Then you got to look at Save. Yes, he was only really a true beast for Season 4, and it was mainly the regional and the 2 OGN splits. And he had sick runs there, and he was absolutely one of the best. He was extremely hard carry style. Admittedly, he got a lot of the team focus around him, but he was one of the best top laners in the world. Fantastic talent. It's a shame he just disappeared and went to shit in China. Then you look at Goon. I feel like Goon's been very maligned, because yes, in Season 5, he shouldn't have been on NaJin, but that's because of the composition of the NaJin players and the fact that they had strengths at top and AD carry. He should have been playing for a team like IM, or he should have been playing for a team. Let's think who else could have used a player like him, actually. So we could have IM. I mean, but basically any team that isn't any of the top 3 teams probably could have used a player like Goo. He's a very strong player. If you build the team around him on a lesser team, he's going to win you games for sure. Very strong player on Champions League Z. So during Season 4, though, I don't want to take anything away from that. During Season 4, he did have periods where he was a really good mid laner. And he was, especially in the spring split, really good. I mean, admittedly, the champion pool, the meta suited him, but he was wicked there. He did outduel a number of people. Very few players could say they were better than him. Yes, people like Faker, people like Dade, people like Pawn. That's about it. He was right above ambition. He was like the 4th best mid laner in Korea, which counts for a lot. Then you go down, no Faye. Now, again, he's someone you don't remember much, because when he left the team was when Shield got really good. But throughout his career, he had one thing that was very interesting, which was he would always have these innovative jungle paths and knowing how to set something up so that the enemy can't guess where I am and what I'm going to do. And he always was routinely very good in this particular sense. And as a result, he was kind of there. I feel like he got fucked over a bit because he had the shield guys while there was still a Brit 2 green. I think he'd have been there as the jungler instead of Watch in spring. I don't know if they'd have gone as far, I can't say that. But I think they would have still been a very dangerous team. And he could have done a lot there. And he almost did make a final with them in the winter season when they had no reason to believe they could at all. Then you got to look at Duke. Very strong top laner. Still is someone who could be one of the best in the entire world if he's on the right team. Apparently he's left NaJin, or had it before they disbanded anyway. So we've got to hope that he can go somewhere because he still has a lot to accomplish, but he hasn't accomplished anything in terms of actual like placings on NaJin because he's been stuck in NaJin hell. And he was getting his time wasted by KT where they kept trying to use Insect top lane, etc. So he's someone who certainly can accomplish more. I'd like to see him play on. Already a great player, but hasn't quite got the accomplishments to be a truly all-time great player. OQ is someone who has a lot of potential, certainly a very strong player, not quite as strong as Duke in terms of relative to their positions, I don't think, but also has no accomplishments in that particular respect. So you look at all this talent they've had. They really should have had more than 2 finals runs and 1 championship. They could have had many top 4s. Almost at round about every split. They should have managed the Shield team better and not left that go. Basically, they always had one team that was up and one team that was down. They could never manage both at the same time, like CJ did occasionally and have good results with both, or SK Telecom did eventually. So you got to look, there were a lot of problems there, but they were one of the great teams. They were one of the forefathers of Korean League of Legends in terms of as an esport and housing great players and building teams early on and fielding a lot of great players. So I will look back on them fondly. I'll remember the good times and the bad. Thanks to Alpha Draft.